Hello, welcome to Free Bible Commentary with Pastor Teacher Dr. Bob Utley. Be sure to visit Free Bible Commentary at www.freebiblecommentary.org. Now, here's Bob.
Today we're going to be in Proverbs 22. This section seems to begin back in chapter 10, verse 1, and run through 22:16. It's a section that deals with contrasting couplets of Solomon. And by that I mean there's really no historical background, there's no literary context. The best approach to this kind of literature seems to be a thematic approach, especially within the book of Proverbs itself. The next concentric circle of significant parallel passages would be wisdom literature, and then the whole Old Testament, and only then the New Testament. These parallel passages are the primary way to deal with these contrasting couplets that have no seemingly connection. It's interesting to me that the rabbis used this technique quite often. They called it pearls on a string. Jumping from one subject to another was their way of keeping their audience's attention. There seems to be some thematic design here, as the word riches appears quite often in this context. But the word riches is one of those major themes: the wealthy, the poor, the naive, the wise. Those are just themes throughout Proverbs, so it's hard to say this is an overarching theme. We'll be dealing with the verses in their contrasting couplets. We're not always exactly sure what these mean. This is where parallel passages are extremely important. I'm going to be reading out of my the Bible in 26 translations at several points. This is, when I paid for this, I paid a bunch of money, and now it's available for $39 for the whole Bible from Baker. The Bible, 26 translations of the Bible. And what it does, it basically has King James in bold print, and from a pool of 26 possible translations, including ancient translations, it gives you what other commentators have thought these verses mean. And of course you realize that every English translation is nothing more than a mini commentary. Let's look if we could. The first one. A good name is more desired than great riches. Favor is better than silver and gold. Now the word good is not in the Hebrew text, but it needs to be supplied, I think, to get the idea. The name in Hebrew meant the character of somebody. That's why we talk about God's name, praying in Jesus' name. The idea of praying in their character, in their spirit. And so the name became a very important way of showing the character of someone. Is more desired than great riches. What would that mean, do you think? Well, I think if I could summarize that, who we are is more important than what we have. Who we are is more important than what we have. And when we have a reputation, now the word favor there, a favor is better than gold and silver and gold. The word favor here, I think, needs to be defined within the limits of Proverbs itself. I hope you'll look up chapter 3, verse 4, and chapter 13, verse 15, for a definition of the term favor, which I think is in a synonymous parallel relationship with the word good name. Now, these proverbs are of three kinds. One, they're synonymous. They say the same thing in a little different way. Two, they're antithetical, means they say exactly the opposite thing. And three, they're synthetic, which means the second line builds on the first. And the way we understand the proverb is what kind of parallelism is employed here. Look at the second one. The rich and the poor have a common bond. Now, literally, it means they sit together, they stand together, they are together, they gather together, something like that. But a common bond's the thought. The Lord is the maker of them all. Now, this goes back, of course, to Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 and 27, that man and woman are made in the image and likeness of God. Man is the creator. Not only the creator, but we're all in God's image. The thrust here is the implication of society, of the worth of a wealthy man and the seemingly insignificance of a poor man is not at all what God sees. For in God's sight, they're both precious because they're all His creation. And so the implications of this, I think, are that God loves all men, that all men are significant. The way we treat one another says something about our love for God. Let me give you some parallel passages within wisdom literature that I think you ought to pursue when trying to explain this verse. First, Job 34:19, And then Proverbs 14:31 and Proverbs 29:13 would be very helpful in understanding this idea, the significance. When I was reading this first line, the rich and the poor have a common bond, I thought I did Ecclesiastes recently, and of course that same phrase is used in Ecclesiastes, but the second line is, they all die. But here's even a more significant way that they're alike. They're alike because they're both the creation of God, and even more than that, the creation of God in God's image. The poor are significant. Now the next statement is, the prudent sees the evil and hides himself. The naive go on and are punished for it. Now let's try to define a couple of words. What is the word prudent? Well, you might want to see back in chapter 1, verse 4. The purpose of wisdom is to give wisdom to the prudent. It's interesting to me, the same word, Hebrew word for prudent, is what's used in Genesis chapter 3, verse 1 to describe the serpent. Now some translations say he was crafty, he was wise, he was subtle. Well, that's what this word means. And so I think this speaks to the idea of those who look at their world and are able to precede what's going to happen, and then they react to the circumstances. They're perceptive people. They look and analyze life. But the naive, now what is that? Well, it's the ideal of the simple, but not simple-minded in the way we use that term. Maybe willfully untrained, willfully rejecting knowledge, willfully walking in their view of life when they know that there's very little or no substantiation for it. Now that's the idea here. You might want to see this exact parallel in chapter 27, verse 12. I wrote down this little Spanish proverb. I believe I found it in Pulpit Commentary. And it said this, the fool does in the end what the wise man does at the beginning. I thought that was quite clever. Now, verse 4. The reward of humility and the fear of the Lord are riches, honor, and life. Now let's look at that a little better. The reward of humility. What is humility? Well, I think in a wisdom context, humility is the lack of pride and a lack of self-assertiveness that allows someone to accept training and teaching from another. You may want to see Proverbs 15:33 and Proverbs 18:12 for some beautiful parallel passages about humility. Now, my New American Standard has the word and after humility, but it's in italics, which means it's applied for English readers. I think maybe the verb is, the linking verb is to be preferred here. I think humility should be linked with the fear of the Lord, and both of them bring riches, honor, and life. Now, I think this might be seen in Matthew chapter 5, verse 5. The meek shall inherit the earth is kind of what this is saying in Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. What is the fear of the Lord? Well, the fear of the Lord is the awe, the respect. It's recognizing that He is the Creator and all of us are the created, that He is the only living one and we only derive life from Him. There's a respect, there is an awe in coming to His presence. Matter of fact, back in Proverbs chapter 1, verse 7, it says the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And I think we see that aspect here. This idea of the humbled having riches, honor, and life, I think needs to be theologically balanced with some of the New Testament and of course the book of Job. It's not true that the humble are always rewarded in this life. This kind of reflects the Old Testament traditional wisdom that those who love God will be rewarded in this life and those who sin will be punished in this life. But I think we realize that judgment and rewards go beyond temporal means to an eschatological setting or an afterlife setting. And we must balance this truth with that. Notice the next one. Thorns and snares are in the way of the perverse. He who guards himself will be far from them. Now again, I must say to you, I'm not exactly sure how to translate this. Thorns and snares. Now is the word are in there, or should it be another verb? There is no are in the Hebrew text. Some would say the perverse put snares and thorns in the way of others to trap them. It's their premeditated plan of evil. Others would say no, that God puts thorns and snares in the path of evil people so that God will trap them, snare them. I'm not exactly sure which it is. I think it's interesting here that it's either the plan or the result. Both are pretty severe. What does the word perverse mean? Well, it means crooked. Remember, I've told you quite often that the word that God picked to describe His own nature, of course He picked holy, but the other word He picked to describe His nature is righteous. Righteous is a Hebrew metaphor from the construction realm. It originally was used for a measuring reed about 15 to 20 feet long, very straight, used to measure the horizontalness of walls, the straightness on a horizontal plane. God took that for His own character, a straightness, a measuring reed. And so all the words for sin are a deviation from that standard. Someone who is perverse or crooked is a sinner. And that's the idea here. Look at verse 6. What a famous verse. By the way, I forgot the last part of verse 5. He who guards himself will be far from them. This is someone who takes thought, knows what's happening in the area of evil, and then willfully chooses not to walk that way. It's someone who guards himself morally, ethically, religiously. You mean there's something we have to do? Yes. We have to know the will of God, then we have to act on it. Now let's look at verse 6, and I want to go, if I could, for a moment to my 26 translations. This is a very famous quote, one we use quite often, and I want to show you the variations here. This is King James. Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. Listen to this one. Train up a youth in the direction of his duty. Even when he becometh old, he will not depart from it. Listen to this one. Give instruction to a youth about his way, and even when he is old, he will turneth not from it. Educate a child according to his life requirements. Even when he is old, he will not veer from it. Train a boy in the way he should go. Even when he is old, he will not swerve from it. And I like this one too. Train a child for his proper trade, and he will never leave it even when he is old. That's a Moffat translation. Now that gives me kind of a handle on these things. First of all, the word train is a very unusual word. Now I brought you one of my favorite books on Hebrew words. This is Synonyms of the Old Testament by Girdlestone. It was written back in 1904. You can see how the pages of mine are coming out now. I've used it so much. But this book is highly indexed, and that's what makes it so helpful. And it compares Hebrew words with Greek words of the New Testament. But it's for a lay person, and this will really help you. When I was looking up the word train, there are two possible etymologies for the word train. One of them comes from Arabic, which is the idea of to taste. It's the idea of a mother chewing up the food for the baby so the baby can take it. So you can see that in the area of training. Train a child at the level he can take. But the Hebrew root is very interesting. It's used numerous times in the Old Testament to dedicate something, to dedicate a building, to dedicate a temple, in Nehemiah to dedicate the walls of Jerusalem. Well, how does this translate to the ideal of dedicate a child? And then another thing I want to say, in the way. Now, in the way literally is according to his way. Well, what does that mean? Train up a child, dedicate a child according to his way. Now, think through this. Here's the possibilities I put. Number one, accentuate the strengths of his character. That's what a Hebrew name was meant to do. Number two, discipline his self-centeredness, but don't break his will and gifts. Number three, build in godly characteristics even at a young age. And that's why the word dedicate would be used. It's interesting for me. This is obviously an emphasis on children being trained in the home by the parents at a very early age. Modern psychology is telling us more and more that a child's personality is set in the first few years of life. Oh my! In these early child training days, and the religious purpose behind them becomes character setting. For many years, people would come to me and they were godly people, but for some reason their children went away from the Lord. And I used to quote this verse, that if you train a child up when he's young, when he's old, he'll return to it. but I was wrong. I misinterpreted out of my heart and not out of my head. I grieve for parents who have children that go away from the Lord. I wish I had a verse for them that promised the child will return to it. But the truth is, what this verse is saying is, you train up a child, and he'll never depart from it. He'll stay in that path. He'll walk that upright life. That's the promise here. It's early childhood training sets the pattern for life. And I think that's what we have to say this means. Now let me go, if I could, to verse 7. The rich rules over the poor. Now the word for rich is singular, and the word for poor is plural. The rabbi said, God made one rich person for every 100 poor people. Maybe that is the reason for the singular and the plural, I'm not sure. And the borrower becomes the lender's slave. Now I want to say that this idea about the rich being a dominant theme and always an exploiting theme needs to be balanced from the wisdom literature itself. And I hope you will look at chapter 10, verse 15, where it really makes wealth a positive asset that can be used in an appropriate way. There's some obviously appropriate wealthy people in the New Testament. Joseph of Arimathea is a good example. But the Bible also says it's very hard to trust God and be wealthy. We tend to put our trust in ourselves, and that becomes a characteristic of the rich as a whole, though not every individual one. Now, when I read this, the borrower becomes the lender's slave, you know, it just hit me that modern America is trapped in credit. We have a lifestyle far above what we can afford, and we sell our future for the current lifestyle. The problem with that for Christians is we buy all these luxuries, then we have nothing to give God. I think if we live so much in debt that we can't give to others who are in need and can't support the ministries of the church, I think we're too far in debt. You see, credit can be a blessing. It can also be a serpent. It's like all things, how we use it. If you're hot to the hilt so you can have a luxurious lifestyle now and keep up with the Joneses, I think you've made a spiritual error, and you will pay for it in many years of servitude to some lending institution or some rich relative, which is even worse. Now, let me go to number 8. He who sows iniquity will reap vanity, and the rod of his fury will perish. I want to show you a set of books before I get too far. I brought these for child training, and I just passed it. This is another set of books that I just love. It's called Ancient Israel by Roland DeVoe. This is the book on religious institutions. This is the book on family institutions. They talk about child training. They talk about borrow and lending and what the Old Testament says. These little paperback books are the most helpful. These 3 books that I brought you, as far as synonyms of the Old Testament, these 2 will help you so much in the Old Testament. And the other book I showed you on 26 translations, if you're a teacher type, you'll just love this for $39. It's like buying 26 translations and have them all in front of you at the same time. He who sows will reap vanity. This is a constant theme of the Scriptures. I think you might want to see Job chapter 4, verse 8. It's very close to this. And some other places I think we see something very close to this. Galatians chapter 6, verse 7. Be not deceived, God is not mocked. Whatsoever a man sows, that shall he reap. Now many believe that the Septuagint slightly changes this verse. And the change the Septuagint gives to this verse seems to be what Paul quotes in 2 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 7. It's even quite possible that 2 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 6 is also a quote from this very verse, Proverbs 22, 8. And I hope you'll compare that and see what you think. He who sows will reap vanity. And of course, the word vanity here is the word for idols, the word for nothingness, the word for vain. He's doing iniquity to try to get something, try to get more of something, try to satisfy a need. But in the end, the means do determine the end, and that which he strove for will just go through his fingers like sand. Now, what does it mean, and the rod of his fury will perish? Well, here's where the Septuagint changes it. It makes it God's rod of fury against the person who exploits people. But it seems to me it's the man who's exploiting the poor, and the rod he's going to beat them with suddenly disappears out of his hand. The rod is a symbol, I think, of the wicked man's rule. Maybe it's a good way of saying oppressors will pass away. Some do believe that it's the idea of God working here. of punishment. And I'm not real sure. The Septuagint, you ought to check that. But the Septuagint is one of the translations used in this 26 translations of the Bible. Now in verse 2, he who is generous will be blessed. Now the word generous here is the Hebrew word, the good eye. Now we don't talk about the good eye or the evil eye very much, but it's a constant theme in the Old Testament and the New. The evil eye was somebody who was stingy, selfish. You might want to see the idea about the eye being a source of wisdom from Jesus' teaching in Matthew 6, verses 22 and 23. And you'll see the evil eye and the good eye there. Some also think that 2 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 6 is blessed are those who give away, for they shall be blessed. But I want to say a word to you. Just stop, wait a minute, and listen to me. Yes, we will be blessed if we give to the poor. But folks, we're going to be blessed with more, not so that we can have more luxurious living, opulent in our lifestyle. We're going to be blessed more by God so we can share more with those who are in need. Oh, you ought to read 2 Corinthians 9:6 again. I think we've misinterpreted it in a materialistic society. Now, notice if it would, in verse 10, drive out the scoffer, and the contention will go out, even strife and dishonor will cease. Now here is, maybe I could put it in another metaphor you're familiar with. One bad apple spoils the whole bushel. Have you ever been in an organization, be it a PTA, be it an office, be it something at church, and there's one negative, critical, kind of a troublemaking person that's always making everybody nervous and tense? Sometimes it's better to send that person away. Now here it's the idea of a willful, irreligious kind of person, a scoffer at God. But I've met them, even in God's kingdom, and they should never be put in places of responsibility. When they are, they should be tactfully removed. Notice here it mentions then in verse 11, he who loves purity of heart and whose speech is gracious, the king is his friend. Now there are many things here I wonder about. The Septuagint makes the he here the Lord, and so do Rashi, Jewish commentator, and Martin Luther. They're saying the Lord loves purity of heart, but it seems to me they're talking about a man, a wise man, a wisdom kind of teacher, and he is pure in heart, and also he has a very tactful speech. So he is an honest person with tactfulness, makes a good friend. And the word the king is his friend is the fact that he can rise up high and be friends even with the powerful. I think you ought to see Proverbs 16:13 for a further description about the king as a friend. Verse 12, the eyes of the Lord preserve knowledge, and he overthrows the words of the treacherous man. I think the best way to characterize this, there is some doubt about how to translate it, but I think it seems to me that God is watching and judging. God is watching God's world is an ethical, moral world. For those who speak truth, God is with them. For those who speak falsehood, they will pay. Now the balance is, maybe not in this life, but certainly in the next. Verse 13, the sluggard says, there is a lion outside, and I shall be slain in the streets. Oh, this is sarcasm. Here's a guy who doesn't want to go to work, and he says, there may be a lion out there, I can't get out of the house. Isn't that ridiculous? Some of these things about the sluggard just amaze me in Proverbs. You might want to see chapter 26, verses 13 through 16. There may be a lion in the neighborhood, but it's not outside this guy's door. Now some say, is there two examples here? Number one, a lion may get me, or number two, if I go out in the street, maybe the town thugs will get me. Well, the Septuagint seems to have two excuses here, the Greek translation, but the Masoretic text just makes the second part of this a description of what the lion will do to the man if he goes outside. In verse 14 it says, the mouth of an adulteress is a deep pit. Now the mouth here, meaning the speech of an adulteress, probably you all look at chapter 7, verses 13 through 20 for what she says. This woman, this prostitute, is also described in chapter 2, verses 16 through 22. An adulteress in chapter 7, verse 5 is obviously a foreign woman who has given her body to the worship of the fertility gods, or she is making a living by prostituting herself. We're not sure. But notice here the idea is that this type of individual is lusting after people to be brought into her sin for her own reasons, not for any other. And those who are lured to the adulteress, look at the next line, He is cursed of the Lord and will fall into it. Now the word cursed here seems to refer to idolatry, and maybe this is a reference to the Canaanite fertility cult to which the Jewish people were so easily prone. And may I say, have a whole lot changed in our day about the power of sex over some individuals? Verse 15. Foolishness is bound up in the heart of a child. Here again is some other terms about discipline. Proverbs speaks a lot about discipline. We looked back in chapter 22, verse 6, chapter 13, verse 24, chapter 23, verse 14, chapter 29, verse 15 talk about discipline. Here it's corporal discipline. And what it means is that the foolishness, willful ignorance, willful disobedience, selfishness, those are natural things of our children. I think it comes from the Adamic nature. But a rod of discipline will remove it far from them. Here is a quote from Meander, one of the Greek prophets. Listen to what he said. He who is not flogged is not educated. Oh, I think there is a place in the Bible for corporal punishment and psychological affirmation. Both need to be. Luther once said, the stick, yes, but put an apple by it. There's a good balance there. He who oppresses the poor to make him much for himself or to give to the rich will only come to poverty. This has been greatly misunderstood, and I think it's because the Hebrew is in difficult shape. Does this mean that a man who takes from the poor will make money, but a man who tries to give to the rich so as to get more back will come to poverty? Well, that seems a bit much. Here's what I really think it is. If you exploit the poor to make money, there's always going to be somebody wealthier than you, and they're going to exploit you too. Now that seems to be the thrust here, as God in Deuteronomy says, I am the defender of the widow, orphan, alien, and the poor. Oh, it's much better to pick on a wealthy person than a poor person. And that's the thrust here. God cares for those who are socially ostracized or cast out. Well, that closes out this section of Proverbs. Remember, a thematic interpretation is better than a contextual or historical, and I hope you'll get the books that I've talked about. I've enjoyed being with you. God bless you. Have a good day.